I'd say the Supreme Court did him a favor by trying to put these tariffs on pause. But of course, the president has just reimposed the similar tariffs using different authority. So it was a very important decision. It was a very historic one, but just shunted the president to using different statutory authorities to levy tariffs. And he's going to move forward with them.
Will we see a legal battle of these new tariffs? Claudia Sahm, it's away from her remit, which is monetary economics, but Professor Irwin, do you just assume further legal battles about 10% or 15%, 120 whatever, 230 this?
Yeah, a lot of numbers being thrown around in terms of the statutes. Yeah, so the new tariffs, which are 10%, he's promised 15%, but they haven't issued the executive order on that quite yet. Those will probably be subject to legal challenge. And that's because the statute allows for the president to impose tariffs in the cases of a balance of payments deficit or disequilibrium. And it's not clear that in an era of floating exchange rates, whether such a thing exists anymore. Now, the other side is that the tariffs can only be in effect for 150 days and then require congressional approval. So there's a lot of uncertainty about how this is going to play out over the next couple months.
Professor, I guess most of our viewing and listening audience, what they know about tariffs, they've learned over the last, 6, 7, 8 years, which is just massive tariffs on all types of countries, all types of products across the board. But typically, how are tariffs historically used and how can they be most useful?
Well, that's really why this administration marks such a sharp break from what we've seen in terms of historical experience. You probably mentioned Smoot-Hawley on the air over the past couple of years. Before that, actually Smoot-Hawley itself, Congress determined tariffs. It's part of the legislative power of tax. It's in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And it was basically Congress's decision what to do. Then powers began being delegated to the president, and we entered the era after World War II of the president negotiating trade agreements to reduce tariffs. And the tariffs have been sort of on a one-way path down since World War II, and that's when enter Trump, and all of a sudden that same authority starts being used to increase tariffs, once again, across different products, across different countries, in all manner of way.
Worldwide and across the nation this morning, Douglas Irwin of Dartmouth College. He is our definitive expert on trade. Only standing with him is Barry Eichengreen of Berkeley. We'll get Professor Eichengreen on in a bit, out with his new book. Paul Sweeney with Professor Irwin.
Professor, we had the New York Fed come out with a report, I guess a week or so ago, that said, 90%-ish of the tariffs have been borne by the American economy, either importers, companies, and even consumers. Obviously, the White House pushing back on that. Who pays really at the end of the day for tariffs?
Well, the importer in the U.S. actually writes the check, but then they pass it on to whoever they're selling the products to, and it sort of goes along the value chain. That Federal Reserve, that Fed study, it's been sort of replicated, that finding that 90% of the tariffs get passed through to domestic purchasers, either final consumers or businesses along the way. That's been confirmed by at least half a dozen other studies. So study after study has sort of consistently shown that, both for the Trump first-term tariffs as well as these most recent ones.
Madeline Marshall has a fabulous video out at the Wall Street Journal. I put it out about a week ago, folks. I'll redo that with the academic input of Douglas Irwin. Doug, your 3 R's of trade policy: revenue, restriction, reciprocity. We're not going to do a quiz at the end of the interview, but Professor Irwin, they're very chronological. And what I find interesting is the restriction, using high tariffs to restrict the imports of McKinley in post-Civil War America. I mean, they were all shown the door in the voting. In 1890, the Republicans, including McKinley, basically lost their jobs. Do you anticipate that in November, a McKinley 1890 kind of vote by America?
Well, that's a very interesting historical observation. And you're right, it does have some resonance for today. So I mentioned the new statutory authority that the president's levied these tariffs. After 150 days, he might have to ask Congress to re-up those tariffs. Does Congress want to vote for higher tariffs in the summer before midterm elections, when Republicans are already divided over trade policy? I don't think so. So it leads into the affordability agenda and prices. And so I think tariffs could be toxic come this fall.
What should China do? There's a lot in the press today
Yeah.
about how China responds. I guess the president's going to, maybe Doug Irwin's going to carry the president's luggage to China.
Could do that.
Yeah,
That'd be
I could
smart.
see it. He could stay in Hong Kong, in Shanghai rather, at the Peace Hotel where Henry Kissinger stayed.
Yep.
I mean, he could do that. Professor Irwin, if you were to go to China with the president, how do you discuss this with Beijing and how do they respond?
Well, I think what Beijing is looking for is stability in the bilateral relationship. And that's exactly what we don't have at the moment. Now, we do have special tariffs on China under a different provision of trade law, and those can be subject to negotiation. But we're sort of in this uneasy truce with Beijing about they're not going to restrict rare earths and we're not going to impose further tariffs. How we move out of that remains to be seen. And it really depends on what the administration has in mind. And then Beijing, I think, is holding its cards close to its chest and probably won't do much until it sees what the administration wants.
Professor, one of the results of the Supreme Court decision last week is maybe some companies, some individuals may want to get some rebates of the tariffs that they've incurred. And just today, FedEx sues the United States to get full refund of emergency tariffs after Supreme Court ruling. Do we have any idea how that process would work?
We have no idea at the moment. So the administration has promised that there will be rebates, but they could be slow walked. And that's why I think we'll see lawsuits to try to accelerate the process. It could take months or even years. It doesn't necessarily have to take that long, but it's clear the administration is reluctant to give up that revenue. And no process has been identified, at least as far as I know, about what the process will be to adjudicate all those claims for the revenue that is amounting to tens of billions of dollars to going back to American businesses that imported foreign goods.
Come on, Blanchflower's going to say, Doug Irwin, David Blanchflower up at Dartmouth, just print more debt. I mean, do we need that revenue? I haven't seen a clear case that we must have the revenue, the first of your 3 R's.
Well, you're right that the Trump administration has used all three of those R's, and revenue has been an important one. And they certainly made the case for the tariffs on the revenue grounds, but they're legally obligated, I think, to turn it back. But the question is, it's not a matter of does the government have the money, but can they go back through the records and isolate those firms that actually paid the tariffs in the first place.
The continuum of you're against the tide. Folks, I can't emphasize enough. It was like Daniel Yergin's a prize. Even if you didn't read it, you walked around with it because it was cool. You had to be cool. So you had Doug Irwin's against the tides. The absolute foundation of your book is Robert Solow, technology. Technology comes to the rescue as America expands in that. Do you just assume our international trade tensions, Doug Irwin, will get fixed by further technology leadership in America?
I think the two are interrelated. I think that the U.S. leadership in technology and other matters gets disrupted with all these trade frictions across countries and the tariffs that are going up and down and can change on a whim. So, trade disrupts that process of spreading technology around the world. It inhibits our ability to export to other countries because there's implicit retaliation against the U.S., and it disrupts all the business relationships that are needed to provide the funds for more R&D. So it's not good for our technological development, but at the same time, technology does march to its own drummer to some extent and will continue to move forward, regardless of what is happening on the trade front.
Professor, is it reasonable to assume that this Supreme Court decision may embolden Congress to try to reassert some of its authority over tariff policy?
Well, it certainly was a wake-up call, and some of the justices really did call out Congress, in not so many words, saying, you have to step up. It's really your responsibility under the Constitution to adjudicate and oversee trade policy. The question is whether they'll do it. Under this administration, I think Congress would act with great trepidation in trying to pull back some of the powers it's delegated to the president. But I think there is a medium-term agenda for future Congresses and future administrations to try to rethink U.S. trade law and ensure that we don't go through the mess and the muddle that we've gone through over the past year.
Professor, is the concept of free trade, is that still relevant in today's global economy?
I think it always remains relevant to some extent. Now, free trade doesn't mean absolutely no barriers and no interventions whatsoever. But I think we do have to distinguish, and former Vice President Mike Pence has sort of made this clear, that between, what he's called for is free trade with free nations. And we have to think about trade as part of our alliance system, as a way of working with allies, and then separating out those countries that are adversaries. And we don't want to treat them the same in terms of our trade policy, because that's an extension of our foreign policy.
Well, that's a really good point here. We're going to have to leave here in a bit, Professor Irwin, but off of your wonderful article, and essay, I should say, in The Economist here in the last couple days, can you explain why we're going after Canada and not China? I mean, I know that I still call him Governor Carney from the Bank of England. Mark Carney, good morning, and everyone up in Ottawa. Doug Irwin, why are we going after Canada when we have true adversaries that we're trading with?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, I'm giving a talk in Canada in about 2 weeks, so I'm going to have to think this through for our Canadian friends up north.
Be careful, you may lose your teeth.
Right, that's right. Yes, high sticking. I'll have to talk to the Dartmouth hockey team about how they prevent such things from happening. But I don't know whether it's a personal relationship that Donald Trump didn't forge with Justin Trudeau, whether there's some real estate deals that went bad in the past, whether there's some other aggrieved parties within the administration that's speaking to the president ill of Canada. But I agree with you in some sense. It just doesn't make sense that here we've had peaceful, cooperative relations with this great neighbor to the north of us for so many decades, and yet we're jeopardizing that with these trade wars.
One final question. I mentioned Davenport, Iowa, the first district of Iowa, where the Congresswoman is fighting for her life. What is your counsel to Republican House of Representative types on the precipice of losing their seats? What should they do on trade?
Well, I think they really have to speak to their constituents about how, in certain ways, they differ from the president. Once again, in the Midwest farm states, they've been hammered with foreign retaliation against our agricultural exports. So American farmers are really suffering. And so they have to offer some sort of promise that there's a better days ahead in terms of the ability of the U.S. farmers to export to other countries. And we're just not seeing it under this administration.